My husband ripped the IV line out of my arm with his bare hand and told the nurse to let me bleed if I wasn't going to behave like an adult about this. That's the sentence I keep coming back to even now, almost 2 years later. Not the divorce papers, not the locks changed on the house in Westlake. That sentence, said in a voice so calm it didn't even sound like rage, just inconvenience, like I was a printer jamming during a meeting he needed to get back to. My name doesn't matter as much as what he called me for 9 years, which was honey in front of people, and nothing at all when we were alone. I was 31 when the bleeding started. 6 months into the second round of IVF, my third miscarriage in 4 years, and my husband walked into the recovery room at Cedar Memorial, holding his phone instead of my hand, scrolling through emails from the dealership he managed. 3 Lexus franchises across 2 counties in Ohio, and he looked at the monitor instead of at me and said, "We need to talk about whether this is worth it anymore." I thought he meant the IVF, he meant me. I'm getting ahead of myself, because that's not actually where it started, that's just the moment I finally understood it. It started slow, the way a foundation cracks slow. You don't notice until the whole porch is tilting and you're standing in your kitchen wondering why the cabinet doors won't close right anymore. Before I tell you about the recovery room, you should know I was the one who built that dealership empire with him. I did the books for the first location out of our spare bedroom when we were 24 and broke. I co-signed the loan with my father's land as collateral. I sat through 11 years of Sunday inventory counts and Christmas Eve closings because December was always our biggest month. My name was on the LLC paperwork. Not because he wanted it there. Because the bank required 2 signatures and at the time, I was the only other person he trusted. That trust ran out somewhere around year 7, though I didn't know it yet. That's around when his sales manager, a 26-year-old named Brooke who wore his cologne home from the office Christmas party. I noticed I just didn't let myself know what I noticed, started handling special accounts. I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself a lot of things, mostly while injecting myself with hormones in our master bathroom, because my husband Richard said children would complicate the expansion timeline if we had them too early. And then later said we needed to hurry up because his mother kept asking. And somewhere in the middle of being told to wait, and then told to hurry, my body just stopped cooperating. Like it could feel how unwanted the whole thing actually was underneath the scheduling. If you're watching this from somewhere cold tonight, somewhere your own kitchen light is the only one on in the house, I want you to know I see you. I was you. Keep that in mind because where this story ends is not where you think. The morning everything broke open, I had driven myself to the fertility clinic alone because Richard had a logistics call with the regional Lexus rep, which I later learned was a 40-minute lunch with Brooke at a steakhouse 11 miles from the clinic. The embryo transfer failed. Not failed gently, failed with complications. A hemorrhage they needed to manage right there in recovery, and I called him 4 times before a nurse finally got through, and when he showed up 90 minutes later he didn't ask if I was okay. He asked if I'd canceled the contractor coming to look at the lake house, because he didn't want to waste the trip if I was going to be out of commission. Out of commission. Like I was a showroom car with a transmission issue. That was the day the IV line got pulled, not by a nurse adjusting a dosage, but by Richard's own hand, because my arm jerked when I started crying and the tube tugged and instead of calling someone over, he just yanked it the rest of the way out himself, annoyed. And there was blood on the blanket, and on his shirt cuff, and he looked at the stain on his sleeve before he looked at my face. I didn't leave him that day. I want to be honest about that, because I think people watching these stories sometimes expect the wife to walk out the second the cruelty becomes undeniable, and that's not how it works when you've spent 9 years building your entire identity around a marriage. I went home. I made dinner. I told myself the stress of the dealership's 3rd location, the one in Mansfield that was hemorrhaging money, was making him into someone he wasn't. The truth came 3 weeks later on a Tuesday, when I drove to the Mansfield store to drop off a contract he'd forgotten, and I found his Range Rover in the back lot next to a sedan I didn't recognize, and through the blinds of his office I saw Brooke sitting on his desk with her shoes off, his hand on her ankle, both of them laughing at something on his phone. Like the whole world was just a private joke between 2 people who had decided I wasn't invited to hear it. I didn't go in. I sat in my car in the parking lot of a dealership I had helped build from 1 location into 3, and I watched my husband laugh with another woman in an office with my name still on the business license hanging behind his desk, and something in my chest went very quiet. Not broken, quiet. The kind of quiet right before you make a decision you've been pretending you haven't already made. He came home that night and told me he wanted a divorce. He said it at the kitchen island while I was straining pasta, steam fogging up my glasses, and he said it the way you'd announce you were switching gyms. I think we both know this hasn't been working for a while. I want a divorce. Brooke and I are serious. I set the colander down. I asked him, very calmly, if he understood that Ohio is an equitable distribution state, and that my name was on every piece of paper that mattered for those dealerships. He laughed. He actually laughed and said his attorney had already explained that the LLC restructuring 2 years prior. Paperwork I'd signed late one night after a 12-hour day, paperwork he told me was just a formality for the Mansfield expansion, had quietly moved my ownership stake down to 4%. 4% of a business I'd built with him from a spare bedroom. I hadn't read it carefully. I trusted him. That was the whole crime I was guilty of, trusting a man who'd been planning his exit for longer than I wanted to admit. He gave me 30 days to find somewhere else to live, because the house, like the dealerships, had been quietly refinanced into his name alone the year before, under the explanation that it would help with our tax position. I left with 2 suitcases and the contents of a savings account that turned out to have $412 in it, because the joint account I thought we shared had been slowly drained into an account I didn't have access to. He kept my grandmother's wedding band in the safe, the one heirloom I had, because, in his words, that should probably get reviewed by the attorneys along with everything else. I want to tell you the part where I found a beat-up apartment with water stains on the ceiling, and a space heater that smelled like burning dust, because that's true. That happened. I lived for 2 months above a laundromat in Mount Vernon with a mattress I bought off a moving sale for $60, working a part-time bookkeeping job because I couldn't get hired anywhere with ran the books for an ex-husband's company, no longer have access to references on my resume. But I also want to tell you about my neighbor. His name was Daniel, older than me by maybe 12 years, quiet in the way that made people in our building assume he was unfriendly, when really he was just a man who'd learned to take up as little space as possible. He had a limp from an injury he never explained right away, drove a 15-year-old pickup with a cracked windshield, and the first time we spoke was because my space heater finally died in late November and he heard me crying through the thin apartment wall and knocked, not to complain, but to hand me an old electric blanket through the door without coming inside, the way you'd help someone without expecting credit for it. We became something like friends slowly, over weeks, the kind of friendship built on small kindnesses instead of big declarations. He'd leave a thermos of coffee outside my door. On mornings he knew I had early bookkeeping clients. I'd bring him leftovers when I cooked too much out of old habit, still cooking for 2 because 9 years does that to you. He never asked about my marriage in a way that felt like digging. He just listened when I needed to talk and didn't when I didn't. It was February when I learned who he actually was, and it happened by accident, the way most important things in my life seemed to happen by accident that year. I was at a diner near the courthouse, waiting on my own divorce attorney, a woman named Carol who I'd found through legal aid because I couldn't afford anyone better, and a man at the counter recognized Daniel through the window and practically ran outside to shake his hand, calling him Dr. Whitfield and thanking him for something about his father's hip replacement. I asked him about it that night, sitting on the cracked front step of our building, because neither apartment had decent heat that worked consistently, and he told me the truth without dramatics, the way he told most things. He'd spent 15 years as an orthopedic trauma surgeon in Columbus, built and eventually sold a chain of outpatient surgical centers across 3 states, and after his wife died of ovarian cancer 4 years earlier, he'd quietly walked away from almost all of it, kept his medical license active out of habit, did volunteer surgical work at a VA clinic 2 days a week, and otherwise lived like a man trying to disappear from a life that had gotten too loud and too empty at the same time. The limp was from a motorcycle accident the year his wife was sick, an accident he half admitted he might have caused on purpose, in the careless way grief makes people careless. He wasn't hiding the money to deceive anyone. He was hiding from the version of himself that had it, the version that had been in the room when his wife couldn't be saved no matter what specialists or money he threw at it. I understood that better than almost anyone could have. I'm not going to tell you it became a romance overnight because it didn't, And frankly, I think that's a more honest story than the ones where grief turns instantly into love. It took until spring. It took him driving me 4 hours to Pittsburgh for a second opinion with a reproductive endocrinologist he trusted personally, sitting in the waiting room the entire time without being asked, and it took me finally saying out loud, on the drive home, that I didn't think my body was broken. I thought my marriage had been the thing poisoning everything, including my own chances. He proposed in October, 11 months after the electric blanket through the door, with my grandmother's ring still tied up in Richard's divorce attorneys, and a cheap gold band Daniel had picked out himself, because he refused to let his money be the reason I said yes. I said yes, Essie. I would have said yes to him, in that mattress-on-the-floor apartment with no money at all. We married in December, small 14 people, at a chapel outside Mount Vernon, 6 weeks after my divorce from Richard was finalized. And I want to be very clear about that timeline, because I know how these stories go, I know what people assume, and I will tell you plainly. I did not marry Daniel until my divorce decree was signed, stamped, and filed with Knox County. I'd lived through one marriage, built partly on paperwork I didn't read carefully. I wasn't going to start a second one with anything blurry in the foundation. 3 months after the wedding, I found out I was pregnant, naturally. No clinic, no injections, no hormone calendar taped to the bathroom mirror. The reproductive endocrinologist in Pittsburgh told me later, almost gently, that prolonged cortisol from chronic stress can suppress fertility in ways that have nothing to do with anyone's body being broken, and that some women's systems simply need safety before they'll allow anything else to take root. I cried in that office for reasons that had nothing to do with the ultrasound, and everything to do with 9 years of being told I was the problem. It was twins. 2 heartbeats on the screen flickering side by side like they'd been waiting for the right room to show up in. I told Daniel in the parking lot of the same diner, where I'd first learned who he really was, because it felt right to close that particular loop there. He didn't say anything for almost a full minute. Then he put both hands on the roof of his truck and just breathed. The way you breathe when something you stopped letting yourself hope for finally arrives anyway. Richard found out the way Richard finds out everything. Through someone else's mouth at a moment designed to be as humiliating as possible. We ran into him at a children's hospital fundraiser gala in Columbus that May, the kind of black tie event Daniel still got invited to from his surgical center days, despite trying to avoid them. Richard was there with Brooke, visibly 7 or 8 months pregnant herself, his hand resting on her back with the proprietary ease of a man who believed fatherhood was something other people had failed to give him. He saw me first. Then he saw Daniel beside me. Then, because the room was warm and my dress wasn't built to hide much, he saw the curve of my stomach, 26 weeks along with twins, and something in his face actually emptied out, the practiced charm dropping away for one unguarded second before he could rebuild it. He started. Twins, I said, before he could finish whatever sentence he'd been building. Due in August. What he didn't know yet, because his own attorneys hadn't told him, was that Brooke's pregnancy had complications stemming from a fertility issue she'd never disclosed to him, something I only learned weeks later through the small, gossiping world of Ohio car dealership wives. And that the baby everyone at that gala was admiring wasn't biologically his. A fact that would come out publicly 4 months later during a paternity dispute that made the local news cycle for almost 2 weeks, after Brooke's actual ex-boyfriend, an account manager she'd reconnected with during the divorce chaos, demanded a paternity test out of his own suspicion. I'm not going to pretend I felt sympathy when it happened. I felt something closer to relief that the universe sometimes does keep its books straighter than people do. Richard's dealership empire, the one with my 4% ghost stake, buried somewhere in paperwork I never had the money to fight, started unraveling around the same time, though not because of me, and not because of karma in any tidy, satisfying way. It unraveled because he'd been quietly funneling money out of the Mansfield location to cover gambling debts most of us didn't know about. Debts that came to light during the divorce-related financial disclosures with Brooke once their relationship also collapsed under its own weight. 2 of his 3 dealerships were sold off within 18 months. I heard he's selling insurance now, somewhere outside Toledo, though I haven't confirmed it and I've stopped checking. My daughters, Ren and Sadie, were born in August, 6 pounds 2 ounces and 5 pounds 11 ounces, 11 minutes apart, in the same hospital system where Daniel had once stood in operating rooms holding other people's broken bodies together. He held both of our daughters before I'd even fully come back from the anesthesia fog. And the first thing I remember clearly when I woke was his face, wrecked and grinning at the same time, the face of a man who'd spent 4 years certain he'd already used up his share of good things. We sold his old surgical center stake the following year and used part of it to open a small outpatient physical therapy and recovery clinic in Mount Vernon, the kind of place built specifically for people who can't afford the gleaming hospital systems 30 minutes away. The kind of place that would have actually helped a man like the one Daniel used to be, limping through grief alone with no one to hand him an electric blanket through a door. I run the books, of course I do. Some habits, the good ones, you keep. I drove past the old house in Westlake once, almost a year after everything settled, not on purpose, just a wrong turn that became a deliberate one halfway through. New owners had repainted the shutters. There was a tire swing in the side yard that hadn't been there when it was mine. I sat at the stop sign for maybe 10 seconds, long enough to notice I felt nothing sharp anymore, just a strange, distant tenderness for the woman who used to live there, the one who thought $412 and a busted space heater were the worst things that could happen to her. They weren't. They were just the door. Some nights, when the girls are finally down and the house is quiet, except for the hum of the old refrigerator Daniel refuses to replace because it still works fine, I think about that recovery room at Cedar Memorial, the blood on the blanket, the way Richard looked at his shirt cuff instead of my face. I don't think about it with anger anymore, not really. I think about it the way you think about a storm you survived, something that happened to the weather of your life and not to the actual ground underneath it. I built an empire once with a man who saw me as 4% of a business and 0% of a person. I'm building something smaller now, quieter, with a man who held 2 newborns like they were the most fragile and most important things he'd ever been trusted with, and some nights I lie awake just listening to all 3 of them breathe, and I think the math finally evened out the way it was always supposed to.